We know higher ed can't continue doing things the way that they've always done them. It's not sustainable. I mean, talking about the death pool of colleges, right? Like it's growing exponentially. So you can't continue to do what you've done. So you have to be innovative. You have to think of things differently. And then you have to be adaptive.
Welcome to Radical Cooperation. I'm your host, Dr. Michael Horowitz, founder and chancellor of the Community Solution Education System, where we believe collaboration is the key to transforming higher education. Here we'll talk with leaders about all things higher ed and examine how cooperation, not competition, drives success. Let's dive in. Welcome to Radical Cooperation. I'm Dr. Michael Horowitz, Chancellor of the Community Solution Education System. Higher education is under unprecedented economic pressure. Rising costs, declining enrollments, and tuition-dependent models leave many schools struggling to balance budgets without compromising quality. And these challenges also open the door to new approaches and new opportunities. So I am delighted to have our guest for today. Jennifer Gantz is the Chief Financial Officer of the Community Solution Education System. She's led financial strategy for our 6 universities and our system, ensuring sustainability and championing innovation. Her experience spans higher ed, healthcare, and nonprofit finance, giving her a unique perspective on how schools can thrive in uncertain times. So welcome, Jennifer.
Thank you, Dr. Horowitz. I'm so excited to be here. I've been looking forward to this, and you know how much I love talking about budgets and planning and really aligning resources with overall strategy of the organization. So thanks for having me.
Indeed. And as you and I often talk about, we're going to talk about money. I think I've told you that Steve Trachtenberg, the iconic president at GWU, used to say, you know, when faculty want better labs, or the fans want a better basketball team, or we want to get better classroom instruction, all of those things for the president or chancellor or CFO come down to money. So, and we're absolutely in stressful times. So one theme I want to carry through is dealing with prioritization and sort of looking against cuts versus investment. And maybe that's a good place to start. Your thoughts on higher ed navigating economic pressures. We have all these costs we can't control. Sometimes they're legal costs, health insurance, software contracts, and we're also committed to a certain level of quality. How do you come at it as a CFO for a university system?
So cutting costs is important. It's also not the only thing. So really taking a important look on what you're spending your money on. As you say, our money. What are we spending it on? And I think that's important. So reducing your expenses can potentially cut into quality, services, reputation, right? So you have to be really intentional on what you're willing to cut. And really, that doesn't get to the heart of the matter, which is revenue pressure. And that's really where I think in my opinion, where you need to spend the bulk of your time. So it's easy to cut costs. It's, as a CFO, you can go through and slash everything and say, you've got to cut this by 10%. And that's actually not how I like to approach cost cutting. I think it needs to be a lot more strategic than that. But really what I like to do is talk about how we invest. So how can we shift what we're spending our money on to something that's going to grow our revenue? And really, I think that's the biggest piece and especially now when we're facing these economic uncertainties, how are we positioning ourselves for the future?
Yeah, cutting costs is often a gut reaction. Another great mentor, boss Ed Harry O'Donnell, used to tell me you can't cut your way to greatness. And I know when institutions have asked me how much will I save by joining the community solution, I say nothing because we're going to reinvest the quote savings into growth. And really, I think about getting higher quality and more resource for the same buck. Mm-hmm. So it sounds like we agree the cost cutting is important to look at, is really a short term strategy, and certainly doesn't answer how you're going to get out of the downward curve and back curving up. What are the risks if you only look at cutting? Because I suppose if you're in a for-profit business and you just cut costs and can keep operating, you're showing profit. Higher education is not just about showing profit. So what are the risks you've seen when the focus is just on cuts?
I think the biggest one is quality decline, right? There's so many that it impacts enrollment, right? So our reputation is one of the biggest things, and our student outcomes, right? So if you continue to cut costs, meaning, you've got not as many faculty as you need, you don't have the faculty expertise that you need, the students aren't getting really what they're paying for, right? So they're not graduating in a way that they feel like they can be successful in their careers. That's a problem. So you can't cut those kinds of things, or else obviously our revenue starts to decline. And fundamentally, so I should stop maybe and say it's not only about revenue and expenses. It's also about our mission. What are we trying to do? How are we trying to make our communities better? And I think particularly with a lot of our new programs, which are medical education, it's not only just making the community better, but it's making sure like you have a doctor who can do the right thing that can help a patient, as opposed to the alternate.
That's so good. So focus on the mission, aligning expenditures and investments to the mission. That's so interesting because we were talking earlier today about one of our colleges that has a signature program in demand. And the challenge, whenever you think about cutting out a low performing program in business, people would talk about it as a product. Higher ed doesn't like to use that yet. We have programs that are green and growing, and sometimes higher ed keeps throwing money at the yellow and red programs with the idea that more money, more people will turn it around. Yet it hasn't met the needs of the current marketplace.
I think you're absolutely right. It's interesting because program prioritization is kind of a lot of times in higher education, not something that most people want to be a part of. People feel threatened by program prioritization because they feel like, oh my goodness, maybe it's going to be my program that's going to go away. So nobody likes to talk about it. Nobody wants to do it, but it's one of the most important exercises. I know for me in my career, it's probably the most important exercise I've gone through. And it's really interesting the way that you approach a program prioritization effort, right? And for me, it's including all of the appropriate people, including them early and including them often. And I think a lot of times, including faculty, on the assumptions, right? Direct expenses, when you're looking at program viability, that's very easy. You can assess direct expenses on a program. Where it becomes a lot more challenging are all of the indirect expenses. So, and that's a lot of the expenses, right? So then how do you make sure that you've allocated those indirect expenses appropriately? And I think the best way to do that is get a lot of buy-in. get a lot of buy-in on the assumptions. What do you think? Do you do it based on the number of students in a program? Do you do it based on the resources that they require? All of those different things, you come up with assumptions, and everybody agrees on the assumptions. And if you can get that agreement, it's just math at the end.
You're into something potentially wonky there and sounds important. So unpack that idea of the indirect expenses, because I think you're right. I'm going to have a program in nursing, and I need faculty and curriculum and lab. So that sounds like direct expenses.
Good job.
That's what good. Yeah. So what is how should a higher ed leader think about indirect in truly assessing program cost and impact?
Well, you have to have it, right? So and this is kind of like just a big assumption, like the cost to keep the lights on. What is that, right? Every program must pay for that. I'll use myself in, everybody must have a business office. We don't generate any revenue, but you have to have it, because if you don't have a business office, you can't collect any of the money from the students, right? Like there's all these different things, as well as a lot of administration, right? Those are all a part of indirect expenses. And I know that we see when times get tough, sometimes you cut administrative expenses, and that never usually works out in anybody's favor, because then you've got a lot of different things that are not being taken care of like they should be.
So we have to look to our CFO to say, okay, these are your direct costs, yet these are the costs that are indirect involved in sustaining this program, to get the true understanding of the finances. I will give you a plug, however, to say that I know as you were spending our substantial construction budget this year, you made sure to not spend it too early and earn a bunch of interest on that money. So that could be an inspiring example of how the finance office is actually a revenue creator. So I know that's not always on the table for the for an institution's finance office, but the creative and appropriate use of funds potentially creates more resource.
100%. So obviously we look at expenses, we look at revenue from tuition, but then another area that we really need to focus on is revenue diversification. And you can do that in lots of different ways, right? You can do that with diversification of programs, which is very important. And then also, to your point, how else can we make money? That's either how can we make the most of our money in our investments? Philanthropy is also grants. Those are different ways, right, that we can diversify our revenue. Of course, we are tuition dependent. That's what we do. That's our mission. And how do we get other revenue to help sustain us in the times where maybe we do have some dips in enrollment and dips in revenue?
Yeah, the revenue diversification is so interesting, because higher ed historically talked about it. Well, there's tuition from programs. Oh, well, now diversify and raise money philanthropically. Of course, most institutions are not that great at it. They often chase it and lose money. And diversification can also be new academic programs. You're diversifying your academic portfolio. In some cases, as we're discussing with our medical school in Chicago, they may want to offer services to clinics and hospitals. One of our colleges rents a substantial portion of their campus that they no longer need in this post-COVID world. So all those things, I think, with the right lens, can be part of enhancing the overall economic picture. Do you have an observation sitting in the CFO's office about why this programmatic prioritization is so difficult in higher ed compared to other sectors of our society?
In higher education, you have a lot of shared governance, which I think is different than if you get into, just a normal company, right? It's a little bit more top down. This is how we do it. This is how we analyze, right? Higher education doesn't necessarily subscribe to that. And I think that shared governance, while is very important and necessary, also makes it a little bit more challenging because you do have a faculty senate that could say, yeah, I don't want to do that. And then there's lots of different things that have to happen in order to change the thoughts. I will say when I have done program prioritization in the past, I went and presented to every single program department to talk through it because there is so much anxiety related to it. And it seemed to be very effective. I think generally speaking, everybody wants the best for the college or the university. People are in higher education because they have a passion for it. And I think that they get nervous about their own.
Yeah, sure. That makes a lot of sense. I think you're right. There's actually a great article or column in this week's Inside Higher Ed about, is the governance model we assume we call shared governance really appropriate and well understood. The board of trustees is really the governing body, right? And then they delegate much of that day-to-day authority to a president or chancellor. Faculty are very critical to the institution, yet their expertise is in academics. They don't have a background in budgets and data. I mean, that's been part of our effort this year to develop a cadre of academic leaders who have that background. So that's an interesting sidebar. By the way, I want to do a little sidebar here to also say you joined our system as the CFO of Kansas, that's on Kansas College of Osteopathic Medicine, which then became Kansas Health Science University. And prior to that, you were working at Newman University. And prior to that, you were working at the Independent School. It was a K-12 private school. Yes. Look at me, remembering.
I know, good job, you.
And prior to that, you were in public accounting.
Yes.
So after public accounting, which was with which firm?
So I started my career at PricewaterhouseCoopers, and I worked out of the office in San Jose. And then I transitioned when I moved to Kansas. They did not have a local office here in Wichita. So I transitioned to Grant Thornton and then worked there until I decided to leave public accounting.
Yeah. And then you've been in nonprofit education since then, first in K-12, then in higher ed, different models. Just note that you provide very strategic leadership of finance. Our finance chair on the board, Victoria Dolan, likes to say that the technical part of financial leadership is easier to find than the relational part. Really, as you rise up to the rank of CFO, you need both. And we have this other trustee, John Farrell, who's been using this metaphor of the widening aperture. And really, you're saying, I think since the start of the discussion, you've widened your aperture way beyond just looking at numbers, but looking at strategy, portfolio, communication, getting people on board with the analyses that need to be done.
Sometimes I feel like a salesperson, like, hey, this is where I think we need to go. And here's some data to support it. So it is actually kind of a marriage of the two things, right? Like how do you look at your strategy? How do you align that with the resources that you're willing to put into it? And then how do you use data to help get everybody on board with where you're going?
Yeah. So listening, adapting, bringing people along. I think I don't remember the TED Talk where the guy said, we're all selling something in most positions. So yeah, do you have an observation on moving from single institutions into the system model? And really you have a unique role as a system CFO and the financial leader for each of the universities and the system. What's that like versus being the CFO of a single school or college?
Yeah, it's very different. In that a single institution can be struggling, right, financially. And a lot of times, at least in my experience, they don't have the resources um, to to buy the things that they need, and have the support that they need as well. So, as an example, and I always like deferred maintenance. Deferred maintenance is very important. I will say deferred IT maintenance has kind of become the new deferred maintenance, because if you don't, and just as an example, my prior institution literally needed to buy 200 windows, which was millions of dollars. And I was sitting at my desk and one of the windows fell out. It actually fell out while I was sitting there. So that's bad, right? Like you need to pay, you need to invest into your buildings. And right now what we're really seeing is you need to invest in your IT infrastructure. And where I've seen it very challenged at the smaller institutions is they don't have that. They have a lot of homemade systems that somebody's patched together. You have somebody who's worked there for 25 years and they're looking at retirement, but they can't retire because nobody knows how to use that system but them. Um, and that's the part that I see as being a part of the system, right? You don't have that. You have the infrastructure that's there. You're not dependent on one or two certain individuals. You have and the board. That's the other part that I, particularly in higher ed, which are typically all volunteer boards, they're not usually experts in higher education. And so a lot of times they'll feel a little bit out of their depth. So they won't feel comfortable asking questions or pushing on things because they don't know. Now, they have a lot of expertise in their own fields. Um, but with the system, you see all of the boards come together and you see them helping educate each other, and they feel more confident to be able to really engage in their fiduciary duty, which is what they're supposed to be doing, helping with, guide the strategy and aligning with the mission. So I think the board engagement and the board knowledge, I think, is a huge factor for the system that I never saw at an individual college. And then really the shared infrastructure.
Yeah, that goes back to that governing, the importance of governance, and scale matters in so many areas. So I think what we keep trying to explain to the rest of higher ed is you can scale human capacity and expertise. You've mentioned IT. I think that was one of our clearest decisions: centralize IT, because 80 people, I'm not even sure what we're up to, working on behalf of 6 institutions across the country and internationally is a better use of resource. And we've seen it, right? As our last institution joined us, they were absolutely doing the best they could. But I mean, given the carve out for IT they could afford, it really limited what they had. So I was really pleased when WASC, our main accreditor, came to Pacific Oaks, and the teams was impressed with the tech software systems that Pacific Oaks College had, which it absolutely would not if it was a standalone institution. And I'm really glad you tied it back to the boards, because one of the trustees I mentioned is our system finance leader, and the other gentleman sits on 2 of the college boards. Yet he's been helpful to us thinking about audit and risk and risk mitigation. Now, I think the final topic, because we could talk all day, I assume, is higher ed as an economic engine, and I'm not sure that gets talked about enough. I know we want to put it out more. I mean, our most dramatically visible impact has been in the city of Wichita with our Kansas Health Science University that's only 6 years young, only its fourth year of students. And I mean, that was a rundown part of the city. I mean, and our building was a boarded up building. And today it's the thriving hub of a new biomedical corridor the state is putting in. We have a new hotel, restaurants, coffee shops. And, we had to do an economic impact study before we opened, and that predicted $1 billion of impact in roughly 10 to 12 years. What are your thoughts about colleges as economic engines in their communities?
I will sell that $1 billion. When I saw the economic impact, was astonishing. I couldn't believe it. I actually had the pleasure of working with the company that did the study, because I got to dive into the details to see really what made this number. Like, how are we going to get to $1 billion? And it was so interesting to see, because when you look at how students are renting spaces, right, in that community, it's a huge impact. When you look at the building, of course, here, that's a huge impact. But even down to the families that come to visit our students, that is also just a phenomenal economic impact. And actually, you've had families that relocate, right? A lot of times students stay where they are. So we only did it for the 10 to 12 years. But realistically, it's actually going to be much longer. We will have that impact. And then there's another component that's not just economic, right? So here in Wichita, for our medical students, right, they have at least one day of service where they go out to all the local, that's during orientation, they go out to the local community and they volunteer across the city. Now, a lot of the clubs and organizations that we have do that throughout the year. So it's a huge economic impact, but it's also socially, right? Like, you see that impact. And I love it. I walk around town and I see people wearing Kansas Calm logos, and I love to see it. I can see our brand out there, and they are really fantastic ambassadors for us and what we're doing.
So, I mean, higher ed is an economic engine. It's been sad to see the college closures that we have around the country. I'll give a shout out to a colleague in Wichita, Jim Long, over at Friends University. He has a podcast called University Deadpool, which is sadly tracking the demise of many small colleges. And so you look at the numbers, that's sort of abstract, then you understand, a community, a town may be losing an employer, the way for students to advance economically. They spend money in the community. So I'm thinking there's a way for certainly our colleges and perhaps higher ed more broadly to help the larger public understand its role as part of a thriving economy. I don't know where it sits today, but I believe downtown Chicago, where I am, is de facto the first or second largest higher ed community in all the United States. I think we have about 60,000 students attending university, medical school, undergrad, specialty colleges, master's degrees, within a mile or so of here. So I'm excited to see what we're going to do in the West Loop, where we are putting in our building. Just a plug for us, that was a big corporation that left town, a building built for a single use. You and I were skeptical that anyone was going to rent that kind of building, and so we were able to snag it. And so instead of being an empty building, pretty large building in the heart of a community, we're now going to have a thriving college campus. So I wasn't on my last topic, because we do one that's quasi financial. You are part of the leadership of our system. What are the leadership mindsets that are important to navigating the economic pressures of today?
I would say being innovative and adaptive. One, because we know higher ed can't continue doing things the way that they've always done them. It's not sustainable. I mean, talking about the death the death pool of colleges, right? Like it's growing exponentially. So you can't continue to do what you've done. So you have to be innovative. You have to think of things differently. And then you have to be adaptive. As we know, there's been a lot of regulatory changes here recently. Trying to figure out how we incorporate those changes and what we're doing in a way that won't impact students. We have to be adaptive. We have to think about things differently. So to me, those are the two main characteristics that a leader in higher education right now needs.
Be willing to act boldly, adapt quickly, bring a sense of urgency to the table. I was at a conference where Arthur Levine, who's been a president many times, came out of retirement to lead Brandeis, and he was making the point that this distinction between liberal arts and professional preparation is artificial. And when people were learning, what we now consider ancient languages, but when it started, they were the languages you used in commerce and business. So it wasn't abstract. And so he's looking, I think, to marry both perspectives. And that's, I think, another example of adapting and rethinking conventional wisdom, because conventional wisdom is sometimes just the wisdom that got stuck, from a prior decade or 30 years ago. Leave us with one piece of advice for your colleague CFOs around the nation.
That feels like a lot of pressure. I think I might echo what you said earlier. You can't cut your way to success. So keeping an eye on expenses is important, but it's more important to understand where you're going and how you can invest strategically to move your mission forward.
Well, Jennifer Gantz, CFO of the Community Solution, your perspectives on financial strategy and innovation charts the path of how institutions can navigate today's pressures and prepare for tomorrow. So thank you for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
To connect with Jennifer Gantz and learn more about her work, visit the Community Solutions website and follow her on LinkedIn. And if you enjoyed this conversation, subscribe to Radical Cooperation and follow me on LinkedIn for more insights. Transforming an institution is never easy, and by harnessing the power of collective action with a strong vision, it can be done. Thanks for tuning in to Radical Cooperation. Until next time. Thank you for listening to Radical Cooperation, brought to you by the Community Solution Education System. Don't forget to hit subscribe so you never miss an episode. If today's conversation resonated with you, we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a rating, share a comment, and spread the word to colleagues looking to foster meaningful relationships within higher education. Together, we can build stronger communities and drive lasting change. I'm Michael Horowitz. Until next time.